The show presents about 100 metalwork reproductions, mainly of Baroque and Mannerist Goldsmith's work, that were among the Metropolitan Museum's earliest purchases. The museum was founded in 1870, very much after the model of the South Kensington Museum, now, of course, the Victorian Albert, with the intention of offering examples for the public or for artists and industrial designers to study, with the larger goal of improving public taste and elevating the standards of design. The arrival in New York of these extraordinarily precise copies was greeted with astonishment, admiration, and some criticism. Soon after 1900, when it became clear that the museum could aspire to a collection of great original works of art, the copies were consigned to storage, where most of them remained until last fall. To explain the technology, which in its day was a radical innovation, we produced a very short animated video, which we're going to screen now.
The Bryant vase was completed in 1876 by a team of skilled artists working for Tiffany & Company. They worked for more than a year, meticulously chasing the sterling silver. Tiffany made a second vase for presentation using the electrotyping process. To make an electrotype, molds are taken of each section of the vase. A flexible molding material is applied to the surface. In this case, gutta percha, the sap of an East Indian tree. The mold hardens, leaving a precise impression. A coating of graphite makes the interior of the mold electrically conductive. Wires are attached to the inner surface. The mold is suspended in a copper sulfite bath with a piece of copper, and an electrical charge is applied. The negatively charged graphite attracts the positively charged copper ions, eventually building up to form a thick copper wall. When the copper is thick enough, the mold is removed from the bath. The copper form is separated from the mold. Additional copies can be made using this first example as a master pattern. The edges are trimmed and filed. The sections are soldered together. Then the copper is plated with silver by immersing it in a bath of silver cyanide with a piece of silver. When the electrical charge is applied, a layer of silver is deposited on the surface. In order to perfectly match the original, the copy is oxidized. On the surface, the two vases seem to be identical in every minute detail, though the copper vase was made in much less time. Electrotyping had far-reaching uses in the duplication of works of art, in manufacturing, and in the printing industry. This technology was one of many radical innovations made possible by the growth of electrical science.
We initially thought of naming the show How the Victorians Reproduced, but the technology is really only one facet of the story. The show is really about the intersection of art and technology, and to explore that further, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ubaldo Vitali, who is a fourth-generation goldsmith who trained in his father's and grandfather's workshops in his native Rome. He studied at the University of Rome and at the Academy of Fine Arts before moving to the United States in 1967, where he founded his own workshop. As a conservator and restorer, Ubaldo has worked for collectors and museums across the country, and as a scholar, he has contributed to many publications and symposia. His own work has been shown at the Newark Museum, the Yale University Art Gallery, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. And in 2011, it was featured in the Renwick Gallery's Craft Invitational. Last year, he was the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. His talk today is entitled Art and Science, the Role of Electrometallurgy in the 19th Century Goldsmiths Workshop. Ubaldo.
Thank you for the introduction. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here and participate at the discussion on electrotypes. Personally, for me, in going through the show, it felt almost like witnessing a resurrection. And for this, I'm very grateful to Ellenor and to the Metropolitan Museum for reopening a very important aspect of 19th century art and technology that unfortunately in recent years have been totally disregarded and shunned by most museums, just as if it was the plague. We have seen here, I'm not going to repeat this part, but the Brian vase is absolutely identical. Actually, I just heard somebody from the audience telling me that the details are better than the original. I was very fortunate to conserve this a few months ago, and these are some images of the electrotype, and I can assure you that perhaps they are better than the original. Here are some images, again, that have already been shown in the animation, that there are many components to an electrotype, so which electrotyping or galvanoplastic or electroforming, whatever words you prefer, is but one of the techniques. They usually include soldering, there are some casting, there are some other done work on it. These images actually show you the front and as compared to the back of the particular detail. And actually it shows you that usually the back of the object does not maintain totally the details. In the front you can actually see, in the Brian vase, we can see the vibration and the modulation of the chasing tool. In the back, if you see it, there are nodules, and those nodules, they actually grow as a result of a deposit, because the plating deposit what is called preferred sites, and also called active areas, and those are nodules on the edges. The purpose of my lecture is because, unfortunately, through the years, electrotypes have acquired an unjust stigma of being just merely reproduction, made more by science than by art. However, historically, the goldsmith, the silversmith, has always been at the cutting edge of technical evolution. And the major task of the goldsmith and the silversmith was to maintain a balance between science and art so that they could merge on equal terms towards a work of art. One of the great dangers for the silversmith, and it happens quite often, it is to become consumed or enslaved by the lure of a specific technique. In this case, we can talk about electrotypes. This obsession with science and technique for their own sake can indeed have the potential of removing, metaphorically speaking, the capital A from the word art. This argument raises the eternal question, is this art? And is this art still remains the dilemma in the silversmith workshop? Kipling, in his poem, The Conundrum of the Workshop, raised the same question, a question I must add that should be kept in mind in every artist. I'm just going to read you a couple of lines. Our father Adam sat under the tree and scratched with a stick in the mold. And the first rude sketch that the world has seen was joy to his mighty heart, till the devil whispered behind the leaves, it's pretty, but is it art? And it is the eternal dilemma, the eternal silversmith question. Yes, it is pretty, but is this art? The topic of my presentation is not to try to answer this question. Instead, I would like to present to you how the goldsmith, in this case Tiffany & Company, subjugated and mastered all the new science and technology of their time only to the benefit of their art in the creation of a new style. Electrotype, I must emphasize this, were but one of the aspects of the many new sciences affecting the 19th century silversmith workshop. and should not be considered in isolation. Before discussing this object, I would like to fly over a few of the scientific phases that led to the electrotype. The scientific contribution came from all around the world at a speed and a pace that is still too difficult to unravel, and you will see from the dates. And I'm sure that what I'm saying could be contradicted in many, many ways by the following speakers, because it depends who do we believe. Obviously, as an Italian, I'm going to start with I tre amici. There were three Italian friends. One was Luigi Galvani, that in 1792 demonstrated animo electricity. His friend Alessandro Volta demonstrated in 1800 to Napoleon the voltaic pile. And Luigi Brugnatelli, in 1805, in front of Napoleon, he plated 2 medals with gold. And in a certain way, electroplating was born. We may question some of the people, but basically it is around this time. Independently from Brugnatelli's work, Sir Humphrey Davy, in 1806, gave the seminal lecture on electrochemistry to the Royal Society. And it was then that electrochemistry as a new science basically was born. The great accomplishment of Faraday, who started as Davy's laboratory assistants, are too numerous to mention. But he is, without any doubt, at least in the mind of many scientists, the greatest experimentalist of the 19th century. The actual invention in 1838 of the electrotype is very disputed, but it is usually given to von Jacobi, a German scientist working in Russia under the auspices of the Tsar Nicholas. I emphasize the word usually, since at the same time many similar experiments were being conducted at the same time in many parts of Europe, and you may hear more about that later. Following Galvani's and Volta's discovery, in the early year of the 19th century, everybody, and I mean everybody, entered the arena of experimental science in the hope of uncovering the mysteries of life as well. Even death itself was often put on a table or on a chair, as you can see in the center of the screen, to see if it could be conquered by electricity. From top left, we can see experiment on galvanism and the possible transfer of animal electricity and magnetism to human. Sitting on the Dr. DeSantis' reanimation chair, we see a cadaver waiting to be reanimated by electrostimulation of his heart and by reinflating his lung with a pump. It is pretty much what today is code blue in any hospital. Experiment on galvanism and electricity were the craves of society who eagerly attended this experiment, especially in England. In London in 1802-1803, Giovanni Aldini, as seen on the upper right, he was actually Galvani's nephew, experimented with corpses of executed cadaver with electricity to stimulate corporeal movement. I am showing the image of Frankenstein to give you an idea of the popularity of those electrical and chemical experiments. The modern Prometheus, written by Mary Shelley, known to us as Victor Frankenstein, comes from this surge of experimentation that was taking place, especially in England. The lower left is actually an experiment conducted exactly in 1818 when the modern Prometheus was published for the first time, and it represents exactly a similar cadaver that had been trying to be reanimated by electrical shock. Fortunately, not all electrical experiments were conducted on corpse. Some of the most important were on electrotype manipulation. On your screen is a newspaper article recounting such an event. It is from the Windsor and Eton Express and is dated March the 5th, 1842. On the upper screen, you see the beautiful, charming bridge uniting Windsor and Eton and the town hall where the lecture actually took place. The lecture was given by Charles Walker. He was the secretary of the Electric Society and a famous author of several books on electricity. He tells us that the experimental portion of this art are within the reach of anyone possessing ordinary industry. And he also says that he would use his best endeavor so to trace out the path to be pursued, that all who feel inclined to repeat his experiments may be supplied with the means. This is the great things that happen in England since the beginning of the 18th century, when great chemists and scientists would go around the town, even little town, and with their little laboratory, their little furnaces, and actually bring knowledge to those towns in a certain way. In a certain way, they were open university, and it certainly showed England, give England a great advantage on the spreading of knowledge. To demonstrate the popularity of Walker's book, and there are many others, is only one. By 1852, we had to remember that the first edition was only 10 years earlier. This was the 25th edition in English language, the second in America, and had already been translated into 3 languages. This was indeed a bestseller. In his introduction, as you can see, I have highlighted, he declares that no branch of experimental philosophy has been more cultivated than electrotype. He also, on the bottom, he had that Dr. Brown was already collecting an enormous amount of copies in Italy from Roman and other antiquities. As shown in the exhibition, the great catalyst for all this science, we must understand that these new sciences actually changed the arts in a way forever. It was the great exhibition at the Crystal Palace in London in 1851. The image on the lower left gives you an idea that is really the pavilion, of Birmingham Pavilion, where most of the electrotypes industry will develop, and you will see that later. I chose the great exhibition because a large number of essays was published with the great exhibition in several languages, assessing its impact in the science and in the relation to the arts. Today, many of these writings appear as prophetic vision. These pages are from the essay in the Journal of Design and Manufacture entitled The Science of the Exhibition. It was written by a scientist himself by the name of Hunt. Here are some excerpts, and they're all from the same page. That gives you an idea of the quantity of great information that is in it. It starts on the top, electricity performing its wonderful work of decomposing and recomposing, as in the process of the electrotype and in the operation of electroplating, be rendered familiar to the public. The great exhibition was indeed the first showcase of the new science of electroforming. A showcase, we should add, that attracted 6 million visitors. That's 1/3 of the England population at that time. And he also, in his essay, he also described the applicability of the electrotypes to large work. It was shown some by Elkington at the time. Further, he writes that there are smaller applications of electrochemical deposits that promise to open up new branches of art. And he continues, exhibits satisfactory proof that much may yet be done in ornamental art. And that's really the topic would be on my lecture. I have also, on the same page, highlighted on the bottom the section where he describes the great improvement in the daguerreotype, the calotype. The calotype was, let's call it superficially, the English version of William Fox Talbot, another photographic process. All of this new science, everything in this page, will be fully integrated into Tiffany creations. The first prophecy coming out of the essay would be in the large electrotype sculpture. And I've only chosen France, but there are in England, in Germany, in America, and everywhere. All of these statues that you see on your screen, they are all electrotypes. They were made by Christoffel. They are either bronze or gilt, but they are indeed an incredible exploit. And if we look at the date is less than 20 years after the exhibition. Again, in France, the statue on top of the bell tower in the Church of Notre-Dame de la Garde in Marseille. It is the largest, even today, electrotype ever built. It is 37 feet tall. Given its size and the difficulty associated with the raising of the statue, the electrotype was made in 4 pieces. The Gattapercha molds weighed over 3,300 pounds. The tank for electroplating contained more than 20,000, and that is British gallons, of copper sulfate solution. That's big. Actually, in the bottom of the left image, you can see the size of a man next to the statue. But electrotype could go from the largest to the smallest. These insects, butterflies, and etc., they are electrotypes in the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. You can see the covers the whole spectrum. And here we come. My lecture again is merging all traditional techniques with the newest science towards the creation of a new style. And I've chosen Tiffany and Company. And I've chosen the year 1876 by 78, just 2 years. You can see on the upper left the Brian vase that is here in the exhibition. All the other objects represented here, they represent a totally different application of many of the new science, including the electrotype. Before we start talking about the scientific aspect, I would like to give basically to set the stage for you. And I will invite you to space travel with me to Tiffany and Company Works and Manufacturing down in 5355 Prince Street. It was within these walls that Tiffany miracle took place. And it was here within these walls that art and many of the new science, as you'll see, merged as equal partners to create, envision, and transform new ideas into styles. Decorative art historians have labeled these styles Japanese, aestheticism, and so on. I would like to call them Tiffany's workshop, and I would like to call them that as a recognition to the approximately 500 talented and committed artists who work within these walls. You will see that these walls are quite different from the image you will see of Elkington. It's not a large factory. If you compare it to Elkington or Cristoforo, you will see they are 2 worlds apart. And yet, in America, within walls like this, is the same thing with the history of Gorham. It was almost like a city dwelling that were turned into factories. And this year that would take place, the miracle. To help me to bring you into the workshop, I'm using actually some documents. And they are the documents. They are a group of diaries and working notes by Charles T. Grosjean. Charles Grosjean was the foreman, the one in charge of the works down in Prince Street. He was a great silversmith. He descended from a family of great silversmiths. He was a great designer. There are many patents of his designs. The most known one is the chrysanthemum one. He was a chaser. We know that he actually gave chasing lessons. Above all, he was a great teacher. He was in charge not just of the workshop, but of the designing department. We will see later on how his psychology of teaching. And he was a great mentor of great artists. So it is through his words that we are going to travel into the workshop. This is a diary. You can see it's a page, and you can see exactly describing, for instance, C.C. Moore purchased this, C.C. Moore purchased that. And the other documents, there are about 15 little notebooks. The other one is a technical ledger. The technical ledger is is derived by the notebooks and the diary. And he classified, I guess intended at a certain point to be published, this one, but he classified things by techniques, and for each technique he actually explained some of the pieces that Tiffany used. On the upper left, you see the famous cup and saucer of the Maquis service. What is interesting here that is put under Champlevé enameling. Yet, the Champlevé enameling in this cup and saucer has has very little to do with the traditional Champlevé. All the recesses for the enamel to be put into, they were not done by carving, but were done by the newest technology of photo etching. And here is one of the technique getting into the workshop. From the diary, and I'll be talking about art before I talk about technology and techniques, because in my opinion, as I said before, art and science walk hand in hand. Art, in my opinion, should precede science. It is unfortunate by the end of the 19th century, science comes before art, and many, many names are given to arts that perhaps do not belong with it. But here you can see just from this page, Seymour sent down an alligator skin so that we can copy, or on the bottom it says, Seymour, that would be Edward Seymour, brought a pepper from his garden in Yonkers, and we took a cast of it. But within the diary, there are other things that we can gather. One is when an object was actually conceived or was ordered. We can see the tray with a butterfly. It was another order from Paris, and you can see the little sketch by Charles Grosjean himself. These sketches are about 1 to 2 inches in size. But there is another aspect on the next page in which he describes, because this is the key of understanding style in the Tiffany workshop, and as art and science merge. In the bottom pages on the next page, he tells us of a trip to the aquarium where he actually saw the Californian salmon hatching, and as they open their eyes and so on, you can actually feel like you have been there. You can see the little sketches that they made. You can see the sketch of a sea swallow, swallow. And next to it, he says, this is something that looks so beautiful, we may use this in decorations. All of those objects will appear in Tiffany designs, and it is important for us to understand because we attribute Japanese and Japanese designs at Tiffany as a mere copy of, let's say, Japanese illustration, engraving, and so on. Japanese artifact and design was definitely the inspiration for Tiffany's work, but they were filtered in an open air, and they were recreated by following nature. Tiffany Japanism has very little to do with Japan art in a certain way. I would like to show you another artistic, how a design is born. On April 2nd, 1879, Charles Grosjean describes, I went down to Fulton Street, and you can all imagine the trip, right? And I bought 2 wild Canadian brook trout and had Mr. Osborne sketch one and color it. I proposed introducing it on pictures, etc. You can see on the bottom right one of those pictures. On the bottom left is actually a real trout. On the upper oval, you see Charles Osborne, one of the great designers at Tiffany. He would be one of the great designers at Tiffany. He had just started working there about 3 months earlier. The point of this is that is how a design is born. You go down to Fulton Street, you get the trout, you have Mr. Osborne design it, and so on. Yet, the salver has been attributed to the design has been attributed to Edward Seymour. Well, he may have given the order, yes, let's go ahead with it, but we know who bought the trout and who designed it. The next page is again more design, and we'll get to the electrotype. And again, I'm showing this because Charles Grosjean, he was a great teacher and a great mentor, and this is the atmosphere in which they worked. Again, he says, Butterfly Inkstand promised to be a success. Mr. Osborne is making a drawing of it in a superb style. By the way, many of those objects will contain electrotypes, okay? And then again, Mr. Osborne brought me a piece of moss from an old tree and suggests representing it on a tree branch. In the diary, we learn of every designer. For the first time, we encounter Paul Dean Farnham, and he says, Paul Farnham brought in a slug that the servant found in his cellar. It was a very beautiful one, spotted like a leopard, and they describe as the slug actually moved and everything so that they could draw it. This is the art of Tiffany. That is how it's born. The inspiration is only the first stage. This is the filter through which Japonism went. And here we go to the first centennial exposition in Philadelphia. You will hear a lot about 1876. And it is uncovering the undetectable use of new technology in Tiffany and Company. I mean undetectable. In the center is Tiffany's famous sideboard dish in silver and inlaid copper, gold and yellow, with a famous legend above the woman listening to Cupid, stating, "To which of the two shall I listen to?" The silver water pitcher in the early Tiffany Japanese style is also inlaid with gold, copper, and yellow. As we look at this object, it's hard to realize that they are the byproduct of the newest technology of photo etching and electroforming, and have little to do with the traditional method of inlaying metals by the Japanese or any others. Tiffany work are purposely meant to appear like a mirage. The real technique should remain undetectable. Mirage is a wish of our imagination. We are not supposed to know how to get there. Incidentally, Charles Grosjean often speaks that impression of technique does not have to correspond to reality. For instance, he states that with some simple illusion, you can make a casting look like a repoussé chasing. In both of these objects, the first stage was to create the recesses into which you could inlay by electroforming the different metal. This was accomplished by the brand new technology of photo etching. The area was first coated with a light-sensitive varnish, then a photo negative of the design to be etched was superimposed to act as a stencil. The area exposed to the light source, by the way, to expose to the light source, it would take about 8 hours, would harden. The unexposed varnish could then be washed away. The uncoated area could then be deeply etched, and subsequently, those etched recesses could be electroformed to the right thickness. Tiffany, by this time, could electrotype or electroform in several metals. They could even do metal in different colors. In gold, for instance, they could obtain green gold, yellow gold, red gold. And by this time, they already realized that with the variation of amperage, with the variation of voltage in the wire connecting the object, would actually receive less electricity and the color would be paler. In some instances, instead of copper that's very conductive, they use brass wires. All these little tricks were all to change colors, to obtain a palette of colors of different types. The beautiful thing, this is the description in the ledger, incidentally, how the varnish is made, how it's exposed and everything. I highlighted that the negative was made out of tin foil because it was kind of unusual. Tin foil, I don't mean aluminum foil, okay? And tin foil was very much in vogue scientifically because that's also as the first phonograph by Edison was made on tin foil. The beautiful thing in Tiffany work is that when we look at this object, the complex science and technique behind are totally unnoticeable. They become immaterial. Colors and the emotion the color brings, it's all that matters. We often talk about neo-impressionists or Seurat and all the things about they use colors as emotions. But the concept of emotions in color was also used by silversmith, and especially by Tiffany. For instance, in this dish you represent a knight by the great Cesare Soligny. That's the central part of the dish. The border is made of iron, and it is photo etched. It is inlaid by electroforming in copper, in silver and gold with maple leaves. If you follow the red arrows that I have there, from one rectangle to another one, once you get to the lower one, that tip of the maple leaf is only 1/8 of an inch in size. And you can clearly see the jagged edge of the etching, the jagged edge and the migration of electroforming into unwanted areas. But basically, it's under a great magnification that you can see those things. On the little left image, you can also see the difference between a carved by a graver line and by an etched line. You can see that the vein of the maple leaf, it's carved by a graver and the rest is etched. And now we come to the tour de force of Tiffany, the conglomerate vase. I composed these things together because in the diary we can, and there is electroforming there as well, you know. But I mean, in the diary we can actually follow the genesis of this vase even before it was conceived. Let's go from the top. January 18, Tiffany and company are about to decide whether to send goods to the Paris exhibition. They didn't know yet. 10 days later, January 28, decided to make mixed metal vase composed of all the metals and alloy used by Tiffany, and we see all the list. What is fascinating are those little sketches. They are indeed the primo pensiero, or at least a recounting of the primo pensiero. And those drawings, again, they are 1 to 2 inches in size, and they're done by Charles Grosjean. The central part is from the ledger, and it will give us the metals and the way it was patinated. I've been very fortunate several years ago to restore the conglomerate vase as well. The right-hand images are from the time of conservation, and they are before it was restored. I'm showing that to you because it gives you an idea that Tiffany was not very sure yet how to control the patination of all these mixed metal, the mokume and so on. So they decided, given the fact that there was only very little time for the exhibition, they decided to make it in separate pieces and assembling it together with pins that would be bent on the inside. What is interesting for our topic for the topic of the lecture is the upper neck of the vase, and again is made by the same techniques. It is photo etched. It is deposited first by copper and then by niello. Niello will be put at the end, and there are notes of the reason why and so on. Tiffany drawings on the bottom gives us an idea of where the actual photography for the negative was taken. And you can see in that drawing that there are sections, they are empty. They are like, those sections were cut out, and all the little pieces of the stencil, once you put them together, they will fit exactly on the neck of the vase. Here we come, just a quick look. Tiffany Japanese vase, Paris exhibition 1878. From the drawing you can see, except for the solid metal, both the shakudo, shibuishi, the mokume and so on, the majority of the decoration is made by electroforming. It says right there, electrotype, dragonfly, bug, flowers, leaves, and so on. In the electrotyping of those things, you can actually make an object into different color without having to solder anything. First you make one part conductive, then the other part conductive, used to different plating stages. Again, we can go through all the list of Tiffany things. Even a coffee pot like this that was made in so many different price ranges, most of the decoration are electrotypes. And there are electrotypes in different metal. By the way, by this time, we had to understand that not just at Tiffany, but we could electroform also in brass. We could electroform in every metal. Most metal, not every metal. Again, one more. You can see, except for the gourds, that they are made of solid Japanese metal. The rest, most of them are electrotypes. Finally, we come to Edward Seymour. I think of Edward Seymour as, everybody thinks the Steve Jobs of today. He was a leader, both intellectually as well as an arbiter of taste, and he was, for silversmith, he was the arbiter of a new era. It is beautiful, although the diary gives a different picture of there are so many people making Tiffany successful. Edward Seymour was at the helm of the company. I would like to read you excerpt from a letter, a recounting of a letter that Edward Seymour sent from the Paris exhibition, and he says, Tiffany and Company exhibits beats anything in the American department. Then he says that England is nowhere. I'm sorry, guys. Elkington has about the same quality, although more of it. as at the Philadelphia exhibition, with the exception of a few imitations of our work in metal. And here we go to, you see the Brian vase, and you see the other little vase, 1876 and 1878, 2 years. Yet they are 2 worlds apart. The 1876 beautiful vase, 33 inches tall, represent England, in my opinion. It was designed by James Whitehouse. It was a byproduct of King's Edward School in Birmingham. His credo came from, we have met, the Journal of Design. It's a journal that didn't last many years, but it's an incredible, incredible journal for design, manufacturing, and so on, with incredible essay. But the only thing that has always bothered me about that journal, obviously I'm very opinionated, it is the fact that they told the young people what was good and what was bad. There is a beautiful essay by Bell in which he entitled the 4 primary sensations of the mind: the sublime, the beautiful, the low or ridiculous, and the painful. The only problem I see is these sensations were the sensation according to the Journal of Design. They were the one that dictated what was painful and what was sublime. And then I compare to, in white is the first issue of the New Path, published by the Society for the Advancement in Truth in Art, right here in New York. The first edition is May of 1863. It's really a manifesto. The part that I've highlighted read, "The artists are nearly all young men. They are not hampered by too many traditions, and they enjoy the almost inestimable advantage of having no past, no masters, and no schools." Later on, they say, talk about England, and they say they were very proud and very enthusiastic about the Neo-Raphaelite movements, the pre-Raphaelite movements, and regarding the movements, they say, if so much can be accomplished in England, where tradition and prejudice are in the very air, what may be done here in our free land by persistent study in the right way? And I'd like to conclude, I'm sorry, because there's one. The 2 vases are totally apart. I mean, one represents, in a certain way, Birmingham and Victorian England. The other one represents a new horizon. It is a new path. There's an open window into the future. It's as modern as you can get, even today. And if you look at the bottom, it's a little sketch. It's in the diary of Charles Grosjean. It is approximately 1.5 inches in size. The most beautiful thing we know is November 21st, 1878. Only 2 years, and look at the miracle. Which I would like to conclude with Charles Grosjean counsel to young artists, because it is under Charles Grosjean tutelage, the Souligny and Paul Dinfern, they really turn into great designers, at least in my opinion. Reading Charles Grosjean is like listening to my grandfather, and those are advices that Charles Grosjean gave to these young artists. Do not follow the old beaten track in anything, but try and find new methods, better, of course, than those in vogue, and that's what Tiffany did. And then he says, another quote is, "The designer should be surrounded by happy thoughts, that his work may not appear the product of labor, but of inspiration and joy." And when we look at Tiffany of that period, their work is a product not of labor, but of inspiration and joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ubaldo, for taking the bull by the horns right away and asking this very important question, is it art? I think we're going to have a lively afternoon. Our next speaker, Angus Patterson is curator of European base metals and arms and armour at the Victorian and Albert Museum in London. He is the author of Fashion and Armour in Renaissance Europe, Proud Looks and Brave Attire, and for the past 7 years he has been editor and designer of the Journal of the Antique Metalware Society. He is currently researching electrotypes for the refurbishment of the V&A's cast course and for a book accompanying the gallery. Today he will speak on the perfect marriage of art and industry, Elkington's and the South Kensington Museum's electrotyping program. So we'll get the English vantage point on the same issues. Welcome, Angus.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for having me. This is going to try and restore Birmingham's reputation. Electrotypes are experiencing a huge resurgence of interest. Research on both sides of the Atlantic is recognizing their historical significance and increasing their importance to the history of collections. Long gone are the days when metalwork curators at the Victorian Albert Museum, for example, would serve the fruit at Christmas on electrotype salvers and photograph each other posing in electrotype armour. This talk presents the electrotype as the perfect marriage of art and industry, the coming together of a huge drive to promote ornamental art and a revolutionary new technology to aid its production. And the V&A was the electrotype's first home. I shall start by showing you a few items from our collection to give an indication of what we have, before exploring in more detail why we have them and how we obtained them. The latter point highlights the role of the great Birmingham manufactory, Elkington, Mason and Company, and its very major contribution in developing the V&A collections in the earliest days. How did the program operate, and was it a success? And why did the V&A and Elkingtons fall out so acrimoniously in 1915? Being a cheerful sort of chap, I plan to finish with a note of optimism for the future. So firstly, what do we have? And they really are that colour, believe me. We have around 3,000 electrotype copies in the collection, made between 1852 and the 1920s, of historic and contemporary objects. We also have approximately 350 type patterns in copper, the halfway stage in the process, more of those later. These copies are of objects in collections that were otherwise difficult to access: royal collections, museums, cathedral treasuries, guilds, and other civic bodies and private collections. Some are copies of objects where we have the original in the V&A as well, such as this 16th century gilt copper gun cartridge case. Some are copies of objects in the English Royal Collection, such as the vase on the left. Others are copies of items from international collections, such as the enormous flagon on the right, the original of which is in the Kremlin treasury, and another copy of which is in the exhibition here. Now, it is easy to assume that electrotypes, by the look of them, are like-for-like copies of silver and gold objects, but the process was also used for copying pewter and brass salvers, leather sword scabbards, and even carved coconut cups. So you can see in the detail there the copper showing through where the patination, to make it look like a coconut, is worn away underneath. The entire thing is copper underneath the gilding and the patination. Now, some of the electrotypes were of newly produced items. The casket above was made by the French designer Alexandre Guiton and was lauded at the Great Exhibition in 1851 for its fine chased work. And the casket below is an electrotype of it, a replica made only 3 years later. And on the bottom right, you can see a catalogue produced by the Department of Science and Art, which administered the museum. That was produced in 1873, and it advertised it for sale, and you could have it in a variety of different finishes according to different budgets and tastes. The electrotypes range, as we've seen, in sizes from small and intricate jewellery, there it is roughly to scale in the very top left, to large-scale silver furniture and bronze doors, and even life-size lions, copies of the silver lions that guard the Danish throne in Rosenborg Castle in Copenhagen. You can see electrotypes in our silver galleries if you ever make it to London, up above the cases. And there are plenty that you can't see as well, because they're down, unless you're brave enough to make an appointment and head down to our crypt, where most of them are in store. One of our more famous ones is the leopard from the Kremlin. You can see why he's popular. And he stands at the entrance to our silver galleries. Here he is there, And another copy of that one is on show here too. These are multiple copies. So why do we have them? We need to look firstly at the museum's aims during the 19th century for the electrotypes to become clear. The collections in the museum were explicitly intended to have a practical, educational effect, both in raising the taste of the general public and in improving the consumer goods produced in factories around the country. The museum was set up before the Great Exhibition of 1851 as an offshoot of the Government School of Design. It displayed primarily modern examples of good design acquired from the 1844 Exposition of Industrial Products in Paris, alongside student work. In 1852, the museum was established more formally as the Museum of Manufactures at Marlborough House in London, just where St James's Palace is, with a much enlarged collection of contemporary works bought from the Great Exhibition on the recommendations of a committee that included the museum's first director, Henry Cole, the art critic Richard Redgrave, and then a couple of very famous names, A.W.N. Pugin and Owen Jones. The museum also housed what became known as the Chamber of Horrors, a room filled with examples of bad design. Now, just as a quick aside, the museum was also briefly known as the Museum of Ornamental Art, and eventually in 1857 it became known as the South Kensington Museum. It was only in 1899 did we become known as the Victoria and Albert Museum. At the time of the Great Exhibition, there was a great deal of concern about the state of English design. The art critic Richard Redgrave described the English manufactures at the Great Exhibition of 1851 as little more than a display of florid and gorgeous tinsel. One American writer, Moncure Daniel Conway, investigating the role of the museum, told how Prince Albert decided the profits from the exhibition should be used to begin the task of raising English work from the abyss of ugliness which had been so admirably disclosed. It was a great triumph industrially, the exhibition, but as far as art was concerned, it was a bit of an embarrassment for England. Now, the original ethos of the museum under Henry Cole on the left was to collect good examples of both modern and antique manufactures for the education of designers, workmen, and the public. Cole emphasized the absolute necessity for examples of historical art easily consultable by the public who are consumers, by the manufacturers who are producers, and by the artists and artisans who were students. The appointment of John Charles Robinson on the right in 1853, he was 27 when he became curator of the entire collection, although not when that photograph was taken. It strengthened the museum's bias towards collecting historic works of art, but still with the goal, in his words, of practical utility. The museum's collecting aimed to get good design into workshops, to find objects, in Redgrave's words, calculated to educate the eye and the hand of the artisan. The workman cannot really see, for his eyes are blind to the excellence of noble things. The museum's remit was actually a lot more public-spirited than that sounds, and came with a moral, reforming dimension. Gaslight allowed the galleries to remain open after working hours and after dark in the winter, drawing artisans in to evening lectures and temporary exhibitions. For Cole, whatever would tend to bring people out of the public houses into the museums would be a very great and profitable gain for the country. In 1863, the collecting activities of the South Kensington Museum were defined more clearly. Original works are to be obtained as far as possible, but where this would seem to be impracticable, a system hitherto pursued of representing the finest known examples by electrotypes, casts and drawings will be followed, fully to illustrate human taste and ingenuity. Electrotypes were therefore important components of this drive to improve Britain's products. The focus of the collection was aesthetic sensibility. Electrotypes made perfectly viable alternatives to the real thing, with the added bonus that they came in multiples and were robust. Reporting to the Select Committee on the Paris Exhibition of 1867, Robinson claimed, "I am strongly of opinion that a fine cast of a medieval thing is vastly better than a debased imitation of it." He goes on to say, "I think you should only show objects in good taste to the working classes and keep all that is bad carefully away from them." Now, this instructive remit of the museum in its early days was reflected in the arrangement of the displays, best expressed today by the museum's cast courts, which were constructed in 1873, are currently being refurbished, actually, and we're putting more electrotypes out in them. Using reproductions, electrotypes, plaster casts, photography, enabled the museum to document the treasures of the world and present them as a lesson in ornament. Teaching was put into practice by the School of Design, administered, like the museum, by the government's Department of Science and Art. The school was founded in 1836. Other small art schools soon emerged, many independently. Conway claimed that by 1882 there were 7 large schools for art training in London alone, and 151 in the whole country, with 30,239 pupils. Electrotypes were circulated around the design schools on loan. Generally, the museum would buy several copies, one to act as a type pattern, one for display in South Kensington, and at least one more for circulation. The museum also had a fund, which still exists, it's called the Purchase Grant Fund, for helping regional museums and colleges augment their collections. Now, electrotypes such as this flagpole base were effectively design aids for students and props for workshops to copy. One journalist wrote, "The most absolutely uninstructed person cannot walk through the building without receiving a lesson appreciable by any capacity of brain that rises above the proportions of idiocy. No artist of fertile imagination can pay a single visit to such a collection without experiencing a powerful and healthful stimulus to his inventive power." Reproductions like this gave the collection its comprehensiveness in the early days. As lessons in ornament were the driving force, modern interest in authenticity was not such an issue. The American writer I've referred to a couple of times was Monsieur Daniel Conway. He was a clergyman and social reformer, and he wrote a book, Travels in South Kensington, with notes on decorative art and architecture in England in 1882. He imagined an invitation to the museum. "Come," said my friend, Professor Omnium, one clear morning, "let us take an excursion around the world. Go round the world with me here in London." So on the one side, there clearly was a strong will on the part of art to acquire perfect replicas in large numbers. Success depended on the capacity of industry to provide them. This is one of the most exciting places in the world. The main suppliers of electrotypes to this programme were Elkingtons of Birmingham, in central England, patentees of the revolutionary processes of electroplating, or many of the revolutionary aspects of electroplating. Using electricity to make perfect metal casts enabled Elkingtons to replicate on an industrial scale. Elkingtons were giants of the metalworking trades, employing over 1,000 workers by the late 19th century, and either developing or buying up a large proportion of the patents for electroplating. Their work is often characterized as mechanized and mass-produced, a prime contributor to the arts and crafts movement at the end of the 19th century. However, they employed superbly skilled designers, and their ability to replicate meant their contribution to both the metal trades and to museum collections was enormous. They were not the only producers of electrotypes for the museum. The museum bought regularly from overseas suppliers, and in England also from Giovanni Franchi and Son of Clerkenwell in London. But when he died, Elkingtons bought his business too. Electroplating, as we have heard, was revolutionary technology. It was seized by the popular press as akin to alchemy. In one of many sources directed my way by Alistair Grant, who's up after me here, the social reformer Harriet Martineau wrote about the magic troughs of Birmingham for Charles Dickens's weekly journal, Household Words, and referred to the plating rooms as seats of magic. One might look on for a year and have no idea of the process. She describes the vats and the wires and the magnetic dynamo, saying nothing ensues until the magician, in the shape of a man in a dark blue blouse, takes hold of one of the wires and unites it with the wires on which the goods are hung. Then in an instant, they become overspread with silver. She describes Elkington as supplying the means to meet a popular need. The process has been spread widely over the continent. What remains to be wished is that our schools of design should be extended and improved, and that a museum of practical work in various departments of manufacture should be attached to them. Well, the process was also written up and debated at length in scientific and art journals, which championed its far greater accuracy than traditional plaster casting. The art journal reporting that the electrotypes are perfect. The finest lines, the most minute dots, are as faithfully copied as the boldest objections. Electrotyping was adopted quickly by businesses that could afford the equipment. The practice of electrotyping has passed from the hands of the man of science into the hands of the manufacturer, wrote the Art Union in 1848. Now, the speed of the acceptance of this new technology was noted with pride by a Birmingham Member of Parliament, Harry Howells Horton. He was keen to present Birmingham to the world and chose 90 pages of truly awful poetry as his method. A flavour of the verse is in the lines on Electroplate. I can hardly bring myself to read them, but Electroplate, that power of modern birth, which clothes inferior metals with new worth. It's the asterisk after the word electroplate that is important for us because it points to an appendix which has extremely useful descriptions of the process and of the impact of this new technology. There are few branches of industry which excite feelings of greater interest in the man of science or the manufacturer than the rapid advance of the electroplate trade, now little more than 10 years established. For scarcely has the period passed when specimens of electro-depositing, such as medals, etc., were shown as curiosities. And Messrs. Elkington and Mason determined to show that in the application of this subtle, mysterious fluid lay hidden one of the most powerful agencies for the promotion and dissemination of a love of the fine arts and for the multiplication of the comforts and luxuries of domestic life. So, what were the fruits of this coming together of art and industry? The earliest correspondence I have seen in the V&A archive, referring to the electrotyping program at the museum, relates to the setting up of a gallery in the museum for the sale of electrotypes in the 1850s. However, later correspondence indicates the way the program ran. Both the Department of Science and Art and Elkington's first advertised electrotypes in catalogues aimed primarily at educational institutions. Here's another page from the catalogue I showed earlier. That's advertising an electrotype of a pewter salver that we also have in the collection. And that one's offering it silvered and oxidized, so it looks like the original pewter object. But the electrotype we have in our collection of that is actually gilded. Again, you can have a variety of finishes according to your taste. And there's a catalogue I found in the Elkington papers in the V&A archive. Again, advertising electrotypes, mostly the ones that they had taken from objects in the South Kensington Museum. And they advertised them particularly at home arts students, i.e. People producing domestic metalwork for interiors at the end of the 19th century. Now, Elkington's also showed electrotypes at international exhibitions, such as in Philadelphia in 1876, which reached a wide and international public. Most of the armour and many of the standing cups and basins you can see in their display there are identifiable electrotypes. Now, this Italian medal can take us through this process of replication, because the museum, what it would do is it would identify an example of good design for copying, such as this medal on the left, Italian 16th century medal, and it would commission an electrotypist such as Elkington or Franchi to make it. The factory would take an impression of the original, usually in gutta percha, as we saw in the video earlier. On cooling and hardening, this mould was lined with a conducting agent such as plumbago or graphite. And a copper type pattern was then electroformed in the mould. You can see the particle by particle deposition on the back of the type pattern there. Now, this type pattern then became the model from which future gutta percha moulds could be made to save going back to the original, which might be fragile or inaccessible. In these moulds, the final electrotypes were made before being trimmed and patinated to look like the original object. You can see it on the right. Now, the original medal here is only identifiable by the little hole at the top that it was once drilled through it to hang it up. We wouldn't do that now in the museum, but that was drilled through to hang it up, whether either early in the museum's days or when it was in a private collection before. And that hole you can see on the type pattern and on the finished electrotype has been filled in by the copper deposits. Now, the accuracy of electrotyping obviously caused concern for the owners of original objects, and particularly for organisations like the Goldsmith Company. Conway claimed this kind of work is now done in such perfection that it is very easy for an untrained eye to doubt which is original and which is reproduction. During Harriet Martineau's visit to Elkington's in 1851, she had been told how a rose had been plated and a cobweb was found afterwards to have been replicated in the process. I mentioned the Goldsmith Company. That was the organisation really with the most to fear. It had devoted pretty much the previous 500 years to regulating its trade and protecting the public against forgery. So it was very vocal when electrotyping came out. It stipulated, for example, that hallmarks picked up in the type pattern should be struck out on the electrotype. It usually happens, But it's surprising actually how often it doesn't. We've got quite a number like this in the collection where the hallmarks have come through. So to protect the interests of the owners of the originals, the reproduction of any object selected by the museum for copying was limited by license and required the permission of the owner. This was obtained through the Department of Science and Art, which retained ownership of the type patterns. Finished electrotypes were required to bear a stamp with the name of the company and the name of the department. The museum was always slightly wary of Elkington's very aggressive self-promotion, resisting Elkington's attempts to register this mark as a trademark. Now, the programme started steadily and then accelerated, particularly after the International Exhibition in Paris of 1867, at which a convention of heads of state and other representatives from important collections signed an agreement mutually to assist the museums of Europe in procuring casts and copies of national objects for the promotion of art. The terms of the convention emphasised that knowledge of each other's art collections and monuments was necessary to the progress of art, and that reproductions of them would be of high value to all museums for public instruction. It pointed out that South Kensington was already showing what was possible with a number of specimens on show in the British section of the exhibition. The convention, you can just about make out there, was signed first by Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, followed by other heads of state. And throughout it was emphasised that the process of copying was now so advanced that no damage was likely to the originals. So state, royal, civic, cathedral, private collections, international collections all provided models for copying. A nice example here, this is electrotype furniture, copies of silver furniture that's in Knowle House in Kent, southeast of London. Also with that set is a very large mirror and a couple of wall sconces, which we also have electrotypes of. Now, the museum also bought, as I mentioned, from overseas electrotypists, such as this copy of a rock crystal mazer cup mounted in silver gilt. The copy is glass mounted in copper gilt. Now, I accept this is not my best effort with the camera, or with the scanner on the left-hand side, but it does make a useful point, because the object, since the object was electrotyped, the original you can see on the left, the finial, i.e. the little handle at the top of the lid, has been altered. The electrotype is therefore an important record of the original object. It also throws up the idea of a project to survey items lost since the 19th century, particularly in the two world wars. The electrotypes may be the only surviving evidence of destroyed European treasures. Now, for the museum, the biggest single accumulation of new electrotypes came from an important mould-making trip to Russia via Denmark in 1880. The Tsarevich had signed the convention. And so much English silver and weaponry went to the Russian state during the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly much sold off by Charles I in the 1620s, that this electrotyping mission gave a massive boost to the study of early modern English decorative arts, particularly silverwork, and generated hundreds of new models that were circulated internationally. A delegation was sent by the museum and Elkington's to take moulds from the treasures of the Kremlin and the Hermitage. Elkington sent Alexander Saty and his assistant Guintini to do the work, along with a young journalist, Alfred Maskell, to write up about the trip. They arrived in December 1880, and the three of them seem to have complained their way around Russia. State festivities, cold weather, Russian fever, whatever that was, and bureaucracy all seemed to slow them down, but even so they were working at a pretty furious rate, producing around 25 moulds a week. Maskell wrote that the work caused considerable dirt, and the smell occasioned by the gutta percha, the hot gutta percha, is also unpleasant. The moulds were all annotated and shipped back to Birmingham for electroforming and reassembly. And perhaps the most famous product of this trip is the large electrotype system that stands in the silver galleries in the museum today, and there's a copy of it in the exhibition here. Ellenor, you may know that there's only 2 copies I'm aware of. That there may be one more somewhere else, I don't know. It'd be interesting to find that out. Some of these really large star pieces were only really intended for copying once or twice. Now, the original of this was produced in London in 1737, and after its patron got cold feet and pulled out of the deal, the banker Henry Jerningham was left with a very expensive object on his hands and an awful lot of debt. And so the system was raffled to help pay for the first Westminster Bridge in London. And the winner, a Major Battine from Essex, was then lent on rather heavily by the government to sell the system to Catherine the Great, and that's when it left England. So its electrotyping and return to England was the first time it had been seen there for about 140 years. So could the electrotyping programme then be said to have been a success? And it's a difficult question to answer because the original aims were about inspiration and were not really quantifiable. Cole not surprisingly, was in no doubt that the museum had democratized design. We have facsimiles of the regalia in the tower. The Queen allowed us to take electrotypes of them, and every local exhibition asks for them. Conway agreed with him. Retrospectively, the schools must be conceded to have done wonders. For one thing, it may be claimed that it found art education in the country at zero and raised it enormously. Between the years 1855 to 77, 27,000 objects of art and 24,000 paintings were circulated by the museum through the United Kingdom. In the various provincial towns and cities, where they have been left for several months at a time, these works have been visited by over 6 million people and copied by many students. If imitation is a measure of success, then more weight can be added to this. The success of the South Kensington Museum has induced other countries to imitate it, wrote Cole. The catalogue of the exhibition Art and Design for All, the Victorian Albert Museum, which is currently on show in Bonn, in Germany, cites 25 museums in German-speaking areas alone, inspired by the English example before 1890, the earliest of them in Vienna and Berlin. Similar establishments were set up in Madrid, Barcelona, Rome, Copenhagen, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Sydney, to name a few. Conway was keen on setting up similar museums in America that could be equipped with casts and electrotypes as teaching aids. In this respect, the International Convention has been of immense advantage. Cincinnati is already sharing these reproductions, and the signers of the above document would gladly have the governors of American states which possess museums add it to their names, and transatlantic museums avail themselves of its advantages. The arrival of electrotypes from across the Atlantic to the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington was a newsworthy event if the Art Journal of 1875 is anything to go by. Another lot of electrotype reproductions from objects in the South Kensington Museum has been received, swelling the collection to the number of 81 pieces, mostly of medieval character, with a few notable ones of a later date. Elegance of design, classic forms and embellishments, heroic uses of some, the quaint fashion of others, and the gorgeous intermingling of gold and silver gilt with bronze make these facsimiles of the art of the goldsmith and engraver in their palmy days great sources of art study. Now, the South Kensington Museum was also a specific point of reference for the founders of the Metropolitan Museum. Indeed, the second director here, Caspar Purdon Clark, you see on the screen, was formerly director of the V&A and a very keen acquirer of electrotypes for the Metropolitan Museum's collections. This is a letter from Elkington sent to the V&A in 1906, mentioning that they had received a request from Purdon Clark for electrotypes for this museum, including one of this touch plate of Goldsmith's maker's marks from Ghent in Belgium. Subsequent letters reveal that the pressure Purdon Clark applied to Elkington's for a speedy delivery, but he did not know the frantic scrambling going on in the stores in London and the warehouses in Birmingham, as several of the type patterns could not be found. Now, I don't know whether it's probably long enough ago for me to confess now, on behalf of the V&A, that new type patterns were made from our electrotypes. So I'm afraid a few of pieces in the collection here are actually replicas of replicas. Now, one of my colleagues at the V&A also found this very good example of electrotypes making it into the workshops. On the back wall of the modelling room of the Birmingham art metalworker Spittle and Clark can be seen two shields, copies of the Bunyan shield and its famous big brother, the Milton shield, the original of which, in silver and steel, is in the V&A and will feature heavily in Alistair's paper. And framed arrangements of electrotypes were still being circulated among the design schools in the 1930s, testifying to their longevity. The circulation department that later ran this program only closed in 1977. However, rather a large amount of criticism was also levelled at the museums and the schools of design. One commentator argued that by allowing its collections to be dominated by historic objects, the museum was rapidly forgetting its origin and use, and is becoming a serious tax upon the country for the purchase of very expensive curiosities. The interests of the genuine workman have been neglected in the formation of the museum, that a gorgeous display might be made of expensive and showy china, enamels, bronzes, etc. The architect in 1881 published a paper stating that the development of the museum emphasized a tendency to allow the glamour of archaeology, antiquarianism, and high art to supersede the flicker of practical and technical instruction. The museum was beginning to be perceived as an exclusive club for connoisseurs and collectors. In 1890, Auguste Wilms, chief art director of Elkington & Co., wrote a paper called Industrial Art, in which he claimed that far from marrying art and industry, the teaching in the museum and schools had emphasized their separation. He took exception to the dominance of ornament over craft, where teaching drawing and art theory, but not its practical application, they were teaching drawing and art theory, but not its practical application, which was left to the workshops. He contrasts England with France, where painting was not unfairly privileged. One section of his paper is an impeachment of South Kensington for professing to use its collections to teach the artisan, but wasting the opportunity by allowing itself to be controlled by painters. He makes an earnest appeal. I urge upon managers of schools of art and design, and upon the authorities of South Kensington in especial, a consideration of the claims of industrial artists as advisors and teachers for artisan students. Now, this dominance of ornament over construction can be seen very clearly in the electrotypes. When the sword is withdrawn from the scabbard, there is no blade, as it's the ornament on the hilt that demanded the copy. The undersides of objects that might reveal telltale signs of manufacturing techniques were not copied. In this 16th century watch case, well, this is the electrotype of it, it opens. But this is not a functioning object in the normal sense. There are no moving parts to it at all. What you can see there is just an impression of the surface of an object, so it's rather like a three-dimensional photograph. Now, the museum and Elkington's never quite sorted out the protocols in the rush to copy. The relationship with Elkington's became sour by the turn of the 20th century and almost hostile by 1915, particularly over the ownership of the type patterns. Elkington's were inclined to trade on their association with the Department of Science and Art, which was meant to be impartial. And the department could never really decide whether Elkington's were its official electrotypists or not. Elkington's, for their part, were frequently upset at the museum's slowness in paying bills, and neither was particularly good at record keeping. There's no delicate way to say this either, but Elkington's were also inclined to make illicit copies. When they borrowed type patterns from the museum, they sometimes forgot to return them, or copied them twice and kept one. And it was not unusual for museum officials to wander around art exhibitions and see unlicensed electrotypes credited to Elkington's. In 1899, Elkington's explained their direct selling of electrotypes to Walsall Free Library by blaming a junior who didn't know the rules. When the museum bought copies of the Roman Bosco Real treasure from Elkington in 1899, it discovered that the company had bought electrotypes of the treasure from a Parisian company, Hack et Hordequin, removed their licensing marks, and made their own copies from the electrotypes. The museum was outraged at having been sold copies of copies, even though, as we have seen, the museum did the same thing to this museum. Now, in 1915, Elkington's had over 350 of the museum's type patterns still in the factory at Birmingham, and the museum demanded them back. It came to a head with an order from the University of Illinois that included a copy of a Henry VIII seal in the Louvre. Elkington had lost the type pattern, and so requested to come to the museum to take a squeeze. That's how they always referred to using gutta percha to take a mould, is taking a squeeze of the V&A's electrotype. Now, the museum was concerned that not only was Elkington dealing directly with the University of Illinois rather than through them, but also at the likely loss of quality of the final electrotype, which needed the museum's approval. Our electrotype was itself, the one you can see on there, was itself taken from a plaster cast. So they were proposing to make electrotypes from a new type pattern, taken from an electrotype copy, taken from a plaster cast, 5 generations removed from the original object. And relations descended to a point where Cecil Harcourt Smith, V&A director, described Elkington's practices as evil. And of Illinois, he said, "I quite agree that this kind of museum must not be allowed to think that Elkington's have any connection, official or otherwise, with us." One museum official wrote to Smith admitting the system of establishing owners' permission for product reproductions had never really been pinned down. "These conditions we maintain strictly, although we have no means of really enforcing them." He goes on to claim the museum should maintain the fiction, even if it be nothing more, that there is a legally enforceable rule preventing Elkington selling copies without V&A permission. So after a rather a lot of very testy correspondence and a thorough search of the Birmingham premises, Elkington sent as many of the type patterns as they could find back to London. Electrotyping was fitful from this period. Beyond this fractured relationship, the museum's focus was shifting to being more of a treasure house, and the collections of historic material were large enough to be self-sustaining, so many of the electrotypes then headed back down to the basement. Now, I promised I'd end on a more positive note. The Elkington factory was a magnificent complex, as you can see from this artist's impression, befitting the company's status as the giants of the metalworking trade. Rather poignantly, little remains now apart from a couple of buildings, including this 3-story listed warehouse built in 1808. A new project to refurbish this building as an Elkington museum is right now on the launch pad. The V&A has the largest collection of Elking material anywhere, including silver exhibition pieces, electroplate, electrotypes, bronzes, type patterns, and the Elkington Business Archive, as well as 150 years of correspondence, 80 years of correspondence between the V&A and Elkingtons. Having demanded our object back in 1915, we are now hoping to send some of this material back up the motorway to exhibit in the museum. This, we hope, will return Elkingtons to the top table of metal manufacturers and once again make their factory a place worth visiting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angus. Those of you who have not yet had a chance to see our exhibition will be struck when you get there at the tremendous parallels between our collection, of course, and the mothership, that of the V&A. And in fact, so insecure with the Metropolitan Museum administration at the time we bought our electrotypes in the 1870s that we asked the V&A to choose for us because we really had no idea what we should have. And not only did they send their selection of copies, they also sent exhibition cases because we thought that we wouldn't know how to build them either. Our next speaker, Alistair Grant, has worked as an artist, a poet, and an historian in Paris and in London. He has contributed to gallery and museum exhibitions, poetry recitals, and publications, public and private sector art commissions, site-specific installations, videos, sound, and live performances in the UK, Europe, and the US. He was lead artist on the redevelopment of the site of the former Birmingham Museum of Science and Industry and Elkington Mason and Company electroplating works, which we've just seen. He is now a doctoral research student and associate tutor in the Department of Art History at the University of Sussex and the Research and Metalwork departments at the V&A, where his thesis is a social history of the electrometallurgy of Elkington Mason and Company. His topic today is the Elkington and Company Visitors Book at the Philadelphia, 1876. Please welcome Alistair Grant.
I'd like to talk about the social impact, really, of the art of electrometallurgy, and in particular its social impact on America. Only two of the Elkington's visitors' books have survived intact. They cover most of the 1860s and 70s and are now in the Victorian Albert Museum at South Kensington, and are currently entrusted to my care in the Metalwork department for the duration of my current research. One book is from the Newhall Street manufactory showrooms in Birmingham and covers most of the 1860s. The other was the book that was taken to record the names of visitors to Elkington's display courts at various international exhibitions, including Paris in 1855, Vienna in 1873, Philadelphia in 1876, and Paris again in 1878. The visitors' book for the international exhibitions also served as an informal ledger of sales, detailing not only the names and addresses of the people that visited Elkington's display courts, but also the artworks that they purchased, often revealing how much they paid, and even the invoicing and delivery arrangements. They are unique social and art historical documents and provide us with a who's who of art and society in the 1860s and 1870s. Most importantly, they reveal exactly who were the art-buying and art-going audience for the new technological art form of Victorian electrotypes. Now, for social and art historians like me, the list of names in both visitors' books are truly remarkable. They present a commentary on the nature of celebrity and social aspiration in the mid-19th century. For me, they bring alive the electrotype collections of the major museums by revealing the provenance, which is an art historian and curator's term for the social lives of artworks. They tell us whom these glittering objects in glass cases, now accessioned and labelled by museum curators as Victorian electrotypes, once belonged to, when and where they bought them, and what we all really want to know about great art, how much it cost. A handwritten index at the front of the visitor's book highlights who was deemed famous in their day. but the process of transcribing and digitizing the books for my research has revealed that the books also contain many names that not only became famous long after they had visited and signed, and other names that only 19th century historians would now recognize. But most of all, the signatures offer intriguingly intimate glimpses of all manner of life stories that history has all but forgotten. Each signature bears witness to individuals from all walks of life and from all over the world, engaged in an extraordinarily iconic Victorian social activity. On the 8th of June, 1866, the Chinese ambassadors to Britain, Pin Chuen, Quang Ying, Feng Yi, Lei Ming, and Yan Kuei all wrote their names in both English and Chinese and dated them 5th year, 4th moon, 26th day of the reign of the Emperor Yongqi. They had come to Britain to represent the 9th emperor of the Manchu Qing dynasty, although it was his mother, the Empress Dowager, who held power behind the scenes. The Chinese call this attending audiences behind the curtain, a phrase that perfectly describes her rule, because the Chinese emperor was then aged just 10 years old. Now at this point I'd like to just step briefly from behind the curtain myself to tell you very briefly how I come to be standing before you all talking about Elkington Mason and Co.'s Visitors book. First of all, I was born in Birmingham. Secondly, between 2006 and 2009, I was commissioned as artist, poet and historian in residence on the £63 million redevelopment of the 2.3-acre site of the former Birmingham Museum of Science and Industry, which was, before it became a museum, the world-famous Elkington Mason and Co. electroplating works on Newhall Street, which is now in Birmingham's historic Jewellery Quarter conservation area. In 2008-2009, I completed the Visitants, a series of laser-engraved sheet steel ghost doors, which are installed as permanent public art in a striking office building and hotel designed by Associated Architects. Each door comprises a calligram, which represents a poetic fragment of the life story of an historic figure that visited the former Elkington Mason and Co. manufactory and signed the visitors' books, sometime between 1843 and 1878. The calligraphic poems are arranged in a way that creates a visual silhouette resonant of a Victorian electrotype. Now, when I first began researching the Elkington Mason and Co. visitors' books for my ghost doors, I quickly found that I was as interested in the ordinary unknown folk that visited the Newhall Street factory or the World's Fairs as I was the rich and famous. I was particularly drawn to the remarkable lives of individuals that history had long left behind. One such individual who I think is of enormous interest to Americans was Elihu Burritt, 1810 to 1879, who intriguingly visited Elkington's Newhall manufactory 3 times, on October 5th, 1865, and May 27th and July 15th, 1867. It was the most number of visits by one individual recorded in the visitors' books. Research revealed that Elihu Burritt was born in New Britain, Connecticut, where he became a blacksmith in the metalworking town that was then nicknamed Hardware City. But through his great aptitude for languages and learning, he published essays and became a social and political activist. Despite his social reform and scholarly activities, he continued to practice as a blacksmith whenever he needed the income, which earned him the popular nickname of the Learned Blacksmith. He opposed slavery long before the Civil War, which brought him to the attention of Abraham Lincoln, who in June 1865 appointed him American consul in Birmingham. President Lincoln approved the appointment very shortly before he was assassinated. After he arrived in Birmingham as American consul in 1865, Elihu Burritt set up house there, calling it New Britain Villa, after his birthplace in Connecticut. He later wrote that it was the only home I ever possessed. His consulship ended in 1869, but he stayed on in Birmingham until the summer of 1870, when he returned to the USA. The first time he visited Elkington's, it was with Anna and Louisa Strickland, his young nieces, who were staying with him. Besides his role as consul, Burritt was a successful writer of travel books, which were read avidly by the British for his American perspective on their country, and by the large number of American tourists that visited Britain after the Civil War had ended. In the preface to one of his most popular books, Walks in the Black Country and its Green Borderland of 1868, he confesses that both his popular travel books and his visits to Elkington's were dictated by his consular responsibilities. It is part of the duty, I'm not going to attempt an American accent at all. It is part of the duty of American consuls abroad to prefix or append their reports of the trade of their respective districts with other facts bearing upon the productive capacities, industrial character and natural resources of the communities embraced in their consulates. In other words, Burrett's visits to Elkington's manufactory were in effect to send industrial espionage reports back to the Department of State in Washington. Now, it's not always the case that Britain is grateful for American espionage, but Burrett's description of Elkington's in 1868 is the finest account of the manufactory written by a contemporary visitor. He writes, "Although Gillett's pen factory is the great lion of Birmingham manufacturers to Americans visiting the town from their childhood associations with his pens, there is another which excites their special admiration when they visit. This is the famous electroplate establishment of Elkington and Co., which, with its affiliations or branch depots, is the most extensive in Great Britain. They may be considered the very fathers or founders of this splendid ware, which cheapens to the means and use of middle-class men articles of elegance and luxury which great wealth alone could once command." Most interestingly, with a mind to the consular trade reports back home, Burrett notes the importance of Elkington's to art education in England. "The establishment is in itself a school of art," he says, "in which genius is trained to the finest conceptions of taste and beauty. No one can estimate the force and extent of influence it puts forth for the culture of a nation. Here are the master thoughts and master touches of artistic genius in designs of infinite variety. Here is 30 years' growth of the productions of that genius in patterns of gold and silver work, shaped to all the varying tastes and fashions of the world of luxury and wealth." He goes on to say, "The educational system by which this great establishment is supplied with reproductive skill and genius may be inferred from the fact that 50 or 60 of the young men attend evening classes at the Midland Institute and take such lessons in design and in the application of science to the different branches of the manufacture as shall fit them for the highest grades of art." Burrett also muses upon the sheer scale of Elkington's art manufactory in 1868. About 1,000 persons are employed in the establishment, who probably represent as much highly trained genius and skill as was ever brought together under the same roofage. First in the high art department stands Monsieur Morel-le-Dieu, a pupil of the celebrated Antoine Vector. This distinguished artist in repoussé or raised work has attained an eminence which has often been recognized and honored. He received a gold medal at the Paris exhibition of 1867 for specimens of exquisite conception and execution. The impressive finale to every tour of Elkington's factory was the famous showroom. By the early 1860s, the Newhall Street showroom at the Birmingham manufactory was regarded as one of the finest art galleries anywhere in the world, and was a precursor to the great public museums like the Victorian Albert and Metropolitan Museum, and the display courts at the international exhibitions. It was also the precursor of the obligatory retail experience visitors get today upon exiting every major museum exhibition. In ascending to the showroom, he writes, one passes between two files of bronze statues drawn up on either side, which represent the perfection of bronze work, which makes an important department of the productions exhibited. Here stand crusading knights in their armour, statesmen, and many of the great masters of their day and generation. The most liberal and generous rule is adopted in making this showroom and the whole establishment accessible to all who wish to visit it. Such persons are conducted through the gorgeous hall and shown all they wish to see with an affable attention and courtesy, which all will remember who have shared them. This policy pays well in sales as well as in the satisfaction it gives to all parties. He concludes, though, with a proud patriotic note about his homeland. He claims that, on counting the names entered in the visitors' book, about 1/4 of the whole will be found to be American. Many persons on that side of the Atlantic who may read these pages will bear testimony to the characteristics of the establishment. However, the American names in the visitors' book for the first half of the 1860s also reveal the great divide in the country's history, as a notable number of those American visitors were Southern secessionists from the 11 slave states, who between 1861 and 65 defiantly wrote next to their names, Confederate States of America. In 1876, Elkingtons reproduced a sense of their famous showrooms at an expressive display court at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. America's first official World's Fair was held in West Fairmount Park as a celebration of the nation's 100th birthday. The USA was still in the throes of reconstruction after the Civil War, but was forging a renewed sense of nationalism by embracing the industrial and technological revolution, and was socially and culturally captivated by a dynamic post-war spirit of modernity. The victorious Union General, Ulysses S. Grant, was in the White House and made the opening address at the Centennial. The USA then consisted of 37 states with a combined population of about 40 million, and about 10 million people, a quarter of the population, visited the exhibition during the 159 days it was open. The names in the Elkington's Visitors Book for the 1876 exhibition at Philadelphia are a who's who of the Gilded Age. Mark Twain had just coined that term in 1873 to satirize the superficiality, greed, and political corruption of Grant's White House administration. But the name now historically recalls the glittering society of that era, and it seems most appropriate for an electroplating company. The first three names in the Visitors Book, dated June 1st, 1876, were Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., Martin Brimmer, and Bayard Taylor. The three men were close friends, and Holmes and Brimmer were neighbours on Beacon Street in Boston. One of the fireside poets, by 1876, Oliver Wendell Holmes was regarded as one of the finest American writers of the 19th century, but was also a pioneer of modern medicine. In 1843, he published The Contagiousness of Puerperal Fever, which had a major impact on modern medicine and anticipated Pasteur's discovery of germ theory. A few years later, in 1846, writing about his pioneering use of ether during surgery, Holmes coined the word anesthesia. However, he was most famed for his poetry, and in particular his popular poem Old Ironsides of 1830. Martin Brimmer was one of the founders and the first director of Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Brimmer served the Boston Museum at the same time as Luigi da Palma Cesnola did the rival Metropolitan in New York, and in the scholarly and businesslike way he conducted museum business was poles apart from the swashbuckling adventurer and archaeologist Cesnola. The visitors' books are witness to which of the Elkingtons' electrotypes were most sought after by the art-buying public, by the art-buying Americans in 1876, and by the same token, what kind of people were buying them. People very like yourselves that were the aficionados of art in America. They were also people fascinated by the modern alchemy involved in the art of electrometallurgy, whether it was an exact facsimile of an historic artifact or a contemporary sculpture by Morel Le Dieu. Victorian electrotypes had an aura of modernity that fascinated a nation which was beginning to lead the world in applied technology. From 1860 to 1890, 500,000 new patents were filed for new inventions in the USA. Several of the works in the current Metropolitan exhibition appear in the ledger of sales of the visitors' books. By far and away the most popular electrotype was the Milton Shield, the great repoussé masterpiece by Elkington's Mason Co.'s chief artist-in-resident, Leonard Morel Le Dieu. Numerous electrotype versions of the Milton Shield were sold to Americans at the 1876 centennial. The electrotypes varied in price depending on the quality of finish required, but almost everyone seems to have ordered an exact facsimile of the original in silvered and damascene steel that was on show at Elkington's display court. Most made down payments of $100 with a further $50 on account, which means it cost about $39,300 today relative to income value. The Milton Shield had been the sensation of the International Exposition of Paris in 1867, so it was almost a decade old when it was exhibited again at the 1876 centennial. It may be an indication of the conservative and literary nature of Americans' popular taste in art in 1876, But it also shows that during the latter half of the 19th century, the Milton shield was regarded as the greatest artwork of the age, and perhaps the finest repoussé bas-relief sculpture of all time. After the Paris exhibition of 1867, the English government acquired the Milton shield for 75,000 francs, and it has remained one of the most important exhibits in the V&A Museum ever since. Now, I don't want to effuse for too long just yet about the Milton shield or Morel Le Dieu, whose monograph and catalogue complete of 1904, L'œuvre de Morel Le Dieu 1820 to 1888, I've just translated into English with a mind to a future exhibition of the artist's work. Just as the Milton shield was commissioned especially by Elkingtons for their stand at the Paris Exposition of 1867, for Philadelphia 1876, Elkingtons commissioned Leonard Morel Le Dieu to create a new artwork. The popular clamour for the Milton shield somewhat overshadowed the Pompeian lady at her toilette. It is a far less intricate composition, but its subject matter makes it equally remarkable. The centennial of 1876 was the first time that many Americans saw nudes as a subject matter in European art, and the controversy made the art gallery in the Memorial Hall the second most popular site at the centennial after the Machinery Hall. In comparison with the Milton shield, only a handful of people bought facsimile electrotypes of the Pompeian lady at her toilette, which depicts a brazenly topless and self-regarding lady, a Roman courtesan perhaps, attended by her clothed servants in the private act of preparing herself in her sumptuous boudoir. A statue of a dancing satyr to the left of the composition further evokes the sense that this is a woman readying herself for physical pleasure. Art historically, it evokes Edward Manet's Before the Mirror, painted in the same year, and his famous Olympia of 1863. Now, among the risque and sophisticated American art lovers who bought electrotypes of Pompeian lady at her toilette, which cost them $110, were W.W. Frazier of 101 South Front Street, Philadelphia, P.R. Pine of 25 East 22nd Street, New York, and W.W. Corcoran, who also bought a Milton shield along with several other electrotypes for his Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington. William Wilson Corcoran was an American banker, art collector, and philanthropist. Unlike most of his contemporary art patrons, Corcoran did not exclusively buy European artworks and owned one of the first important collections of American art. By the mid-50s, his pictures and sculpture were cluttering his house on Lafayette Square, and he hired the prominent architect James Renwick to build a gallery in the Second Empire style on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. Before he could complete his private gallery, the Civil War began, and Corcoran, a Southern sympathizer, fled Washington for Paris, where his son-in-law George Eustace Jr. represented the Confederacy. Corcoran arrived in Paris during a period of huge artistic creativity, just as Manet, Degas, and other artists were radically challenging the traditions of academic practice. After the defeat of the South, he returned to Washington, but had difficulty reclaiming his property, and in 1869 handed his gallery and much of his collection over to the government. It was officially opened as the Corcoran Gallery in 1874, 2 years before the centennial. Another big spender at Elkington's on Independence Day 1876 was Mrs. Samuel Colt, the widow of the American gunsmith and industrialist. She bought a pair of Celadon vases. The visitor's book does not actually specify that they were electrotypes of Chinese or Korean pottery, and Elkington's did exhibit cloisonné enamels at the Philadelphia exhibition in 1876 with great success, designs by August Wilms, Frederick Elkington, and Christopher Dresser. But I've not yet identified the Celadon vases bought by Elizabeth Colt, but she paid the considerable sum of £300 for the pair. When the Civil War broke out, magazines and newspapers became an important cultural force in America. Magazines became more sophisticated and were no longer loose-leaf pamphlets or one-page journals, but became printed and bound periodicals. By 1870, there were 5,691 newspapers in circulation, compared to 715 in 1830. Fletcher Harper was America's most famous publisher and magazine editor in the early to mid-19th century. He visited Elkington's on October 13th, accompanied by the artist Theo R. Davis, although neither of them appear to have purchased anything. With his brothers James, John and Joseph Wesley Sr., Fletcher had founded the Harper and Brothers Publishing House. Fletcher was responsible for the magazines, and in 1850 he founded Harper's Weekly and Harper's Magazine, followed by Harper's Bazaar in 1867. Theo R. Davis was an artist who is best known for his numerous drawings of important military and political events during and after the Civil War. His most famous drawings include the Battle of Champion Hill and a sketch of the meeting between General Johnston and General Sherman at Bennett Farm to agree the terms of surrender of the Confederate armies. Fletcher Harper published many of his drawings in Harper's Weekly. Fletcher also gave the cartoonist Thomas Nast his start in Harper's Weekly, allowing Nast great editorial freedom in his biting satirical and polemical cartoons. Harper's Weekly came to prominence because of Thomas Nast and Theo R. Davis's depictions of the Civil War, prompting Abraham Lincoln to call Harper's the greatest recruiter for the United States military. In the presidential elections of late 1876, Nast played an influential role in promoting Rutherford Hayes's election to the White House. According to Albert Payne Bigelow in his 1904 biography of Nast, Hayes claimed his cartoons were the most powerful single-handed aid to his election. Thomas Nast quickly became disillusioned with Hayes' Republican administration, but lost his forum to attack Hayes in Harper's Weekly when Fletcher Harper died in 1877 and was replaced by his nephew J.W. Harper Jr., whose editorial ethos was very different to his uncle's. Thomas Nast visited Elkington's on September 20th, signing his name with his trademark T.H. Nast and giving two addresses, Morristown, New Jersey, or Harper's, Franklin Square, New York. He bought an electrotype of the Milton Shield. J.W. Harper Jr. also visited the Centennial and purchased an electrotype of one of Francois Briot's pewter basins and ewers, the Temperantia basin. It's now one of the highlights of the pewter collection at the V&A Museum. However, it may have been the Briot's basin in the Louvre that was bought as an electrotype by J.W. Harper, as both were made into electrotypes by Elkingtons. Every year, the winner of the women's singles at Wimbledon Tennis Championship holds aloft an Elkington electrotype of Briot's dish. Briot's basins are amongst the finest examples of Edelzinn, which literally translates as precious pewter. It was produced in France and Germany during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. During the late 16th century, fashionable patrons favoured fantastical designs in the Mannerist style for their courtly displays. This style incorporated complex decorative designs of virtuosic craftsmanship and subject matter filled with intellectual references. Because Edelzinn was designed for display rather than function, it has tended to survive in good condition. The Temperantia basin, designed by Briot, has had a widespread influence. Francois Briot was the most celebrated member of a French family of medallists and die cutters. Technically, he was primarily a carver, creating copper moulds in which pewter was cast, a medallist, modeler, and pattern maker, rather than a traditional pewterer. However, by far and away the most illustrious American that purchased an electrotype of the Milton Shield at the 1876 centennial for a long time eluded me in my research. But thanks to my own surname, I kept puzzling over the name of O.E. Babcock, whose name appears in the Visitors' Book on the 1st of August 1876. Next to his name, his address simply reads, Washington, Milton Shield, without any price or payment details listed. Moreover, beneath his name is written in faded ink, for Mrs. Grant. It's just here. Finally, I got round to transcribing this page and discovered that Orville Elias Babcock was a general in the Union Army, whose aide to Ulysses S. Grant was responsible for selecting Wilmer McLean's house as the site of General Robert E. Lee's surrender. Now, as an historian, I was annoyed at myself for having watched Ken Burns' epic documentary so many times without retaining Babcock's name. But suddenly, I became extremely excited at the thought of that faded for Mrs. Grant beneath his signature. After the war, O.E. Babcock remained on Ulysses S. Grant's staff throughout the turbulent Reconstruction period. When in 1868 Ulysses S. Grant was elected as 18th President of the United States, Babcock was appointed as his private secretary and went to work in the White House. Suddenly it was clear to me that Mrs. Grant was Julia Dent Grant, 1826 to 1902, the First Lady of the United States from 1869 to 1877. Now, as a social and art historian, I have a strong interest in life history, which means I'm an avid reader of memoirs. Two of the most compelling of American recollections are those of Julia and Ulysses S. Grant. Julia Grant's memoirs map a gently articulate woman's remarkable journey from an idyllic childhood on a slaveholding plantation, which she called one long summer of sunshine, flowers, and smiles, to marriage to the man that fought and won the brutal war to end slavery in America. She was the first lady to write a memoir, though she was unable to find a publisher, and had to wait almost 75 years before the personal memoirs of Julia Dent Grant were finally published posthumously in 1975. In her memoirs, she recalls some of the art she chose for the White House, and on page 189 I found the following recollection. I also had the pleasure of selecting for the Executive Mansion a magnificent bronze shield on which was wrought in honour of Milton, some of the scenes from Paradise Lost. It was very beautiful and called the Milton Shield. These articles are still at the White House and are universally admired. After she acquired the electrotype of the Milton Shield at the Philadelphia exhibition, Mrs. Grant hung it in the Red Room of the White House, which she used as her private reception room. The following year, after Ulysses and Julia Grant had left the White House, it provided the decorative backdrop to the oath of the president that followed Ulysses S. Grant, the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. President Hayes was the first US president to take the oath of office in the White House. He was sworn in prior to Inauguration Day because it happened to fall on a Sunday, and so he took the oath privately on the evening of Saturday, 3rd of March, 1877, to ensure that America was not left without a president for a day. He took the oath again publicly on Monday, the 5th of March. Now, in 1908, Gilson Willett's book, Inside the White House, recounts a wonderful description by an unnamed writer of 1876 of the Milton Shield as a prominent new acquisition in the Red Room of the White House. No photograph exists of it there, though. And on that night when the oath was taken, which was the only presidential oath taken actually within the White House, the red parlour in which the ceremony took place is the room which had been used by Mrs. Grant as a private reception room. It is situated on the ground floor on the west side of the Executive Mansion, between the banquet hall and the violet blue parlour, and communicates with both. The room has recently been furnished in a style known to upholsterers as the English version of the Queen Anne. Many of the ornaments about the room suggest historical reminiscences. On the mantel there is a large gilt clock representing the residence of Benjamin Franklin at the suburban resort of Passy near Paris. Beside it are two rare Meudon vases. A notable feature of the decoration of the room is a large electrotype copy of the Milton Shield modelled by Morel, the original of which is in repoussé work in iron and silver. The copy was purchased by Mrs. Grant at the Centennial Exhibition. Now, a number of things strike me as interesting about the choice by Julia Grant in 1876 to place the Milton Shield as a notable feature of the decoration in the White House, and also its backdrop to Rutherford B. Hayes' oath of office the following year. Firstly, the Milton Shield is an apocalyptic depiction of the defeat of the banished archangel Lucifer by the archangel Michael, which clearly resonates as a visual and literary analogue of Ulysses S. Grant's role as the commander of all the Union armies that defeated the Confederacy. The central panel of the Milton Shield depicts the archangel Raphael telling Adam and Eve of the war in heaven, in which the archangel Lucifer rebelled against the righteous will of God and was expelled from heaven by the archangel Michael. It seems an appropriate metaphor for the social and political disintegration of the United States during the Civil War in the cause of ending the evil of slavery. Moreover, Ulysses S. Grant always referred to the Civil War in his memoirs as the Great War of the Rebellion. The literary critic John Leonard has asserted that Paradise Lost is, among other things, a poem about civil war. Satan raises impious war in heaven by leading a third of the angels in revolt against God. The term impious war implies that civil war is impious. Ulysses Grant wrote in the conclusion to his own personal memoirs, "The cause of the great war of the rebellion against the United States will have to be attributed to slavery. The war between the states was a very bloody and a very costly war. One side or the other had to yield principles they deemed dearer than life before it could be brought to an end. I commanded the whole of the mighty host engaged on the victorious side." Paradise Lost is also about the temptation and corruption of Adam and Eve by Satan and the subsequent fall of man and expulsion from the Garden of Eden. That the Milton Shield also provided the backdrop to President Hayes's oath of office also seems apt. The presidential election of 1876 was one of the most disputed and controversial in American history, after fraud by both Republicans and Democrats. The infamous Compromise of 1877, in which the Democrats agreed to Hayes' election in return for the Republicans agreeing to withdraw the Federal Army from the South, effectively ended Reconstruction and ceded influence over the southern states to the Democratic Redeemers. One can argue that the Compromise of 1877 meant that America had to wait almost a century until the African-American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to truly win the Civil War. It was a victory for the Republican Party, but not for Hayes, democracy, or Reconstruction. Hayes swore his oath privately in the Red Room under the Milton Shield. Many Americans refused to accept Hayes' presidency as legitimate and nicknamed him his fraudulency, or President Brother Fraud. Now, I'm very grateful to Ulysses Deitz, the author of the book Dream House, The White House as an American Home, for providing me with a few leads on the fate of the White House's Milton Shield. During Benjamin Harrison's tenure in the White House, the Milton Shield was moved upstairs into the second-floor Oval Library, which is now called the Yellow Oval Room. The low-level positioning of it between the bookshelves of the President's Library seems sympathetic to such a literary work. Ulysses Deitz suspects that it remained there until 1902, when Teddy Roosevelt and Stanford White purged the White House of anything that they deemed to be too modern. For me, the internal provenance of the Milton Shield in the White House only adds to my conviction that this is the greatest artwork of the 19th century and the finest reproductive artwork in history. It is one of the best things in the exhibition of 1867 and has always a crowd of admirers around it. The work in it is of the finest quality, and the ideas which are expressed in that work are not only full of poetry, but sometimes also reach even to the sublime, exclaimed the Times of the 4th of September 1867. It is easy to see why the Milton Shield's apocalyptic depiction of the victory over the rebel angels spoke so powerfully to Americans in 1876 and was bought by so many of that generation who had survived the Civil War. More than any other artwork, it typifies the art of the Victorian electrotype, blurring the conceptual boundaries and value distinctions between the copy and the original masterpiece. Only by looking for the telltale technical signs of electrodeposition on the rear can you tell the difference between the original in the V&A and its numberless exact facsimiles. Now, I'd like to bring this full circle, as it were, to Bardo's talk about Tiffany's, because there is one last illustrious American name from the visitor's book that I should mention. On October 12th, L.C. Tiffany signed the visitor's book. Next to his name is the address, care of Mrs. F.A. Tiffany, Grand Hotel, 31st Street and Broadway, New York. Next to which it lists one Cellini cup. It is fascinating that the glass designer Louis Comfort Tiffany should purchase, and at $100 it really wasn't cheap, an electrotype facsimile of an artwork attributed to the semi-mythological and certainly self-mythologizing 16th century mannerist goldsmith and sculptor Benvenuto Cellini. It was not until 1902 that the younger Tiffany became the design director of Tiffany & Co., the jewelry and metalwork company founded by his father, the great American jeweler and patron of the Metropolitan Museum, Charles Louis Tiffany. It's on the left. The name Tiffany in the Elkington's visitors' books seems to me to symbolize the passing of the bejeweled baton, the beginning of the cultural ascendancy of America and the decline of Britain. By the century's end, inspired by the commercial success, pioneering technology, and manufacturing methods of Elkington, Mason & Co., the American silversmiths of Tiffany and Gorham had superseded in scale of production, commerce, and design innovation the great British pioneers of the Victorian electrotype. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, for that wonderful example of how a single document can open a window into an entire century and illuminate the individual lives of some of our great public figures. Our next speaker, I'm going to move over here. Our next speaker is glass artist Michael Glancy, who received a BFA from the University of Denver and a BFA and an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, where he studied with Dale Chihuly. Thank you. His heavy-walled vessels, meticulously carved and encased with metal, have been included in exhibitions from Japan to Basel and in the US from Detroit to Miami. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is one of dozens of museums whose collections include an example of Michael's work. Most recently, in 2011, his glass was the subject of a book and a solo exhibition organized here in New York by the Barry Friedman Gallery. Michael and I are going to discuss electroforming in the contemporary studio. And I should add that when I started out with this electroforming exhibition project, I contacted my colleague Jane Adlin in the Modern and Contemporary department and said, is anyone using electroforming in contemporary work? And she said, oh, yeah, there are a handful of people, but you really have to talk to Michael Glancy. And I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to do that. Michael's work is characterized by this vase acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in 1997. In fact, it was the second piece. The first Glancy piece was bought by the museum as early as 1980, very early in his career.
Excuse me. Actually acquired in 2007.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for
10 years later.
Made in 1980. Got it.
27 years after the first piece was acquired by the Metropolitan. I'm quite proud of that. So I wanted to.
We didn't lose interest.
No.
But Michael's work, I'll just flip through a couple of examples and then let him talk about how it comes about, both technically and artistically. This is a heavy piece of glass, and the valleys that you see are, in fact, electroformed areas of metal. Here, another piece of 1990 with this extraordinary, precise geometry, richly textured and richly colored. And more recently, this piece of 2009 with similar features, and here's a detail. Michael, perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about these three pieces, or how they came to be.
I think it's probably appropriate to show the next image. It's a photograph taken of a 20-year-old business and economics major having some therapy in the School of Art. And this is the moment really when I found my passion, I think, which was not economics and business. But this journey has been a long one, and But when I discovered my passion, I looked to have instruction, and so I visited with Marvin Leposki on the West Coast, who is one of the better-known glass workers, glass artists, and Dale Chihuly at the Rhode Island School of Design. So this leads us, and I suppose the best way to say what happened was that I was smitten by smoke and fire, which I think is still a very valid motivator today. I can mention that the Corning Museum of Glass has 7 portable furnaces that they will take to various parts of the country and put on cruise ships, and they take them to exhibitions, and they're always extremely popular. And that's purely smoke and fire. In 1978, I made RG Squared, which was one of the pieces that I felt really did work and convinced me that my, at that point, 8-year investment in molten glass was a good decision. Maurice Marneau became very interesting to me, and I sort of view Marneau as my spiritual mentor. And when I really became serious with glass, that took me to the Rhode Island School of Design, where I studied with Dale Chihuly.
So this heavy-walled vessel by Marneau on the left-hand side of the screen is cast, is that right?
No, it's actually a solid blown vessel, and all of the deep cut is with hydrofluoric acid. And when I so one of the first things I did upon arrival at the School of Design was to make my own acid etching facility. And I hadn't done much research on Marneau at that point, but pretty soon, I mean, I just thought you blew the object, you put a resist on it, put it in the acid, go have lunch, come back, and we have a deep etched object. This piece probably took over a year for Marneau to execute. And if you look at it very closely, you can see that the bosses have steps in it. So he would actually have to etch the piece of glass in the acid. The acid would break down the glass into an inert salt, and then he'd have to remove it, remove that, put a resist on, and put it back in.
So your piece on the right is blown, and then carved,
with sandblasting, and then etched with the acid. So basically, I spent quite a long time emulating Marneau, and I was quite successful doing that. But my pieces look like they were made in 1934. The Rhode Island School of Design was where Dale Chihuly was, and in 1974, I went to study with Dale, and Dale is very well known for having created the Pilchuck Glass School. Oh, yes. No, that's me. So while at the Rhode Island School of Design, they have a professional requirement to take classes outside your major. And I probably wouldn't have done it if it weren't for a requirement. And so I took classes in the jewelry and metalsmithing department, copper and silver, what's not to like about copper and silver. And I didn't really have any intention of integrating the two materials, but within the within the jewelry and metalsmithing department, there was a very primitive and small electroforming facility. It's really the size of a small closet. And this was the first object that I executed. It had been blown and carved with a sandblaster, which I was attracted to because it was a much more modern cut in the glass. And when this process was explained to me, one of the beauties of this material choice that I made, this lucky material choice that I made of blown glass. Glass is one of the world's great insulators, and so wherever you want the metal to go, you put a metallic, you put a metal paint. The paint that I was using was a silver-based paint that was used by the electronics industry to make circuit boards. So I meticulously painted it, put it in the bath, took it out after some time, and was extremely excited. When I saw this piece, I knew that I had found another major interest. And so I live in a New England home, very old, bad lighting. I was really happy. I went home, had a beer or a cocktail, and I was brushing the metal before the patina with a fine brass brush to brighten it, and I was just feeling very, very proud of myself. Put it on the mantelpiece, and next morning in the light of day, I looked at it, and the metal had chipped off all over the piece, and I was shocked at that. Whoa, looked at it, and I decided, okay, it's fragile. I can deal with that. But the actual truth was that this is a science. It's a chemical environment, and the baths were way out of balance, and it would take me about 3 years before I could learn what I needed to know to control the process to the point where I could actually say, in the presence of the bath, that I knew what I was doing.
So you had access to some of the specialists in Providence who had been serving the jewelry industry there, long established, and you made use of their knowledge as you mastered the technology?
It was a little bit awkward in the beginning because they would see me coming down the hallway and take an immediate right or left to avoid, because I really didn't know very much and it was tedious to them. What they didn't realize was that I would follow them into whatever room they went into. But the truth was that I always carried a piece with me, and my question would be specifically concerning something that was happening with the object. And I believe that the work won them over, and I just wouldn't go away. So ultimately, they did help, and they still help me a lot when I need it. But so 1977, I got married to my wife, Robin. We went on our honeymoon, and we went to the Pilchuck Glass School, which is a 50-square-mile campus in the middle of a 50-square-acre, in a 5-square-mile experimental tree farm 60 miles north of Seattle. Beautiful place, sparsely populated, and with lots of cows. One of the Pilchuck Glass School has become the preeminent workshop. It's a school, but it's mostly a summer workshop that invite some of the finest glass workers in the world. And you're brought together to work with these people. I had met, in 1977, Jan Erik Rietzman, quite a bit older than 15, was the first Grand Master to come to the School of Design, or Pilchuck, and we shared a bathroom and got to know each other, and so between Jan Erik Rietzmann and the other Scandinavian artists who were there, they told me most of the American glass, hot glass industry is based on Venetian paper-thin traditions. The Scandinavian tradition is for a very heavy-walled object, which I was attracted to because I'd be carving half of it. And so the Scandinavian artist and Jan Erik invited me to come to Sweden and work with them there. And so we have this slide to show you the original skin of the object, and there are several steps to the evolution of my pieces. The first step, of course, is to execute them in the hot shop, and that's really more about form and color. And then they're sent back to my studio, where I will engrave them. The three lenses that you see in the center band are actually engraved, very traditional European stone or diamond wheel. And then the sections above and below have been carved with the sandblaster and then painted with the electrically conductive paint, put into the bath and electroformed.
So the red band around the middle represents the original high surface of the vessel as it was blown, and the grid pattern is carved in a negative and then plated with a metal. You use the word skin to describe this metal coating that you use, and related it to the oxides that Marino used.
Yes, because the metal is not actually fused to the glass, it actually lays, is a skin or a jacket that's on the surface of the glass. It's extremely strong. If I were to drop the glass and the glass were to break, which is unlikely because it's really quite thick, but it's quite hardy, but that has happened. The metal is thick enough and strong enough to keep the glass together. And so I thought I'd show a few shots of the process to prepare the object. Number one, top left, I make a design. You can see a design on the table there. I cut out rubber stencil that's used by the monument industry. If somebody dies and you need a headstone, I always thought there was a little German guy cutting out the name and the date, but it's actually done with sandblasting and with these rubber self-adhesive materials. So I borrowed that from industry. You lay it out, put it in the sandblaster, and carve it. The sandblaster acts like a paintbrush that reduces the material instead of putting material on. So it doesn't really, it has abrasive coming out at a high speed, and like a BB gun on a glass window, it chips the glass. Wherever it hits the stencil, it bounces off, keeping the glass protected. And then in the bottom image, the entire piece has been sprayed with an electrically conductive paint, and then the stencil is removed, and because glass is an insulator, the metal goes in the carved area, but not on the glass. From that step, it's cleaned up. Wires are attached to the piece. It's taken to the electroforming studio, which is really a more empirical, scientific area. So a lab book is a very important thing. I've been teaching a class at the Rhode Island School of Design since 1981. this class in electroforming of copper to jewelry students who work on wax, industrial designers, sculpture students, glass students. And this is it's a good practice for our really creative, artistic types to have a little bit of empirical discipline. And they respond pretty well to it. From this stage...
When Michael saw the animated video that we did illustrating the process, he sort of shook his head and said, well, it's a little more complicated than that, because indeed the bath has to have motion in it, the ingots have to be in exactly the right relationship to the vessel to be plated, and a million other things, some of which are recorded in these crazy lab books showing rotations and changing of the solutions and
problems. There's quite a bit. It's mostly chemistry. There's a little bit of physics with fluid dynamics and magnetism, but mostly it's magic. And this is, although my studio scale is quite a bit smaller than the major producers in England in 1850. This is my biggest tank, and so you can see where the electricity would be introduced into the grid from these wires. The object becomes the cathode and is negatively charged, and the bars of, thank you, and the bars of copper become the anode, and over a period of time, more time for larger pieces, less time for smaller pieces, you get this metal deposition. I live in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, the birthplace of public education in America. This photo was taken in 1900s of my studio up by the street. By the time we moved in, it had moved to the back of the property. The house is 1750s, and so when I decided to convert the barn into a studio, I have a great respect for anything old, and so even though the building was about to fall down, instead of tearing it down, which would have been easier to build my studio, we decided to straighten the building and to put new material on the inside and the outside, thus giving the building a soul. This is the studio as it was last year, not this winter. And inside the studio, I make my objects. You can see that there is a pierced wax object. You'll see a piece from that. There's all sorts of notes and experiments on the wall that basically solve certain problems for me. I can't do this alone. I have 2 assistants that help me a couple of days a week. And I think you'll see one of them in the next,
We haven't really talked about the extraordinary and exquisite degree of finish on these objects. And although you can see it pretty well in these slides, to hold them in your hands is even more remarkable, because they're big, but the scale of this detail is absolutely minute. And some of it happens with a sandblaster, but a lot of it is gone over carefully by hand.
A lot of it is filed and sanded and burnished, but it's not for everyone, but for me it's very good. I recently gave up tobacco about 10 weeks ago for the first time since 1964. And the focus, I mean, it's driving me a little bit nuts, and I'm trying to deal with it, but the work has been very useful because I can really focus all of my attention.
Michael, can you talk about this plate, this base piece that your pieces seem to sit on, and how you arrived at that?
Early in my studio, not everyone who is fascinated by molten glass is good at manipulating molten glass. I don't really know any glass workers who are very, very talented at blowing the glass, at the hot work of the glass and the cold work. And so my skills blowing glass that's what I really was attracted to, but I wasn't as accomplished as I wanted to be. It actually took, you wouldn't think it's very far from your brain to your hand, about 3 feet, but it took many years before I could get something that was in my mind into my hand. And so while I was frustrated with the glass blowing, I would spend a great deal of time with cutting and polishing and carving and engraving of the glass. And so one time, my blown glass pieces were quite rare, the good ones that I really liked. And so I would buy industrial glass as like pages from my notebook. And so these would be, the base plate would have started off as a 3/4-inch piece of plate glass that would be used for, say, a coffee table or something. And I could easily get these and carve them. And so they became literally pages from, 3-dimensional pages from my notebook. And one day in my studio, I had a piece that I had made earlier and a base plate that was made sometime later. And the two just fit together perfectly. Of course, I made both of them. They weren't made intentionally, but the minute that I put them together, I realized that the base plate was giving a landscape or an area of protection to the objects. And so it was a focal piece in my first New York show in 1980 and attracted the attention of a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so being the smart guy that I was, I decided to do that some more. This is in my studio, which I kind of think of as my sanctum sanctorum. I would rather be here than in my studio than anywhere. And I'm sanding, filing, and burnishing this object, which is called fluid dynamics. The piece has two sides to it. This is fluid dynamic night. The other side is fluid dynamic day. They're radically different sides. And I sort of attribute this to my mom, who would take the furniture, and she had things hidden in drawers throughout the house. And for the summertime, she would put slip covers over the furniture and roll up the rugs and put grass rugs down and put summer things down. So I don't know. That's probably not why I do it, but I think of her when I'm trying to tell stories. I am assisted by Miles Baer, who started with me. He's a third-generation Mason. He's actually a musician, but being a third-generation Mason gives him incredible hands. And so as a result, he's been with me for 16 years and is one of the top engravers, glass engravers in the world, I think. So he's actually engraving the glass, a German tool, diamond wheels. It's really a several thousand-year-old process. The only thing that's really changed is the material of the wheels, the sintered diamonds. And so blown glass, the surface is frequently heavily engraved. The next image, you'll be able to see some of that engraving on the surface of sterling dark matter. And most recently, I've been working with Adrian Evans, who is a glass artist and fellow faculty member at the School of Design. Adrian's expertise and skill set are in mold making and in wax work, and glass casting. And so I've become quite interested in traditional foundry techniques as well as the electroforming. And she's working on one of the base plates, a footed base plate that an object will be presented on. That will be cast. And I think her next piece.
You mentioned actually when we were looking at this and talking about it that there's a very interesting parallel really to the Victorian electrotypes, because the key there was exquisite molds that were enabled by this new material, gutta percha, the latex that we've been talking about. And so in a sense, there is a coming full circle with the importance of the mold maker for this work.
And this is actually a cast piece of glass, and the subtlety is very personal, really. The Scandinavians are offended by a random bubble that may be in their crystal glass, and so if there's a bubble in there, they'll go in and actually pull it out and remove it surgically while the glass is molten. In the case of the cast pieces, not only are we able to control the color of the glass and the shape of the glass, but we're also able to control the density, and we're able to actually put bubbles into it. And when it's carved, those bubbles are then translated into the metal. I don't know if you can see, there's a texture up here. It's quite subtle, but for me it's very exciting and is a heavy motivator as to why I'm casting.
And just to be clear, it's just the glass blank that's cast, and the carving through sandblasting is done in exactly the same way as for your earlier blown pieces.
And then electroformed.
And electroformed in the same way.
And after the electroforming, I work in copper primarily, and then it's electroplated with silver or gilded with gold. I don't know if you can gild with silver. Can you gild with silver? No, just gold. And the newest piece that I've made is cast high-polished stainless steel with a solid turned stainless steel core, because we are teaching computer-assisted design at the School of Design, and if we teach it, we should use it.
So it's not glass at all, and
there's no glass.
Is that the future?
No, it's a future. I'm really doing it. My first and foremost love is molten glass. The electroforming I've gotten quite good at because I've been doing it for a long time. I'll continue doing that, but these are just experiments to continue my knowledge and enthusiasm. So
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think we will probably, the four speakers, head up to the gallery now. If you have questions, we'll do our best to address them up there. I hope everyone has a chance to see the exhibition, and thank you very much for coming.